Hello. It was a Friday night when the first thread of my carefully woven life started to unravel. Ethan, my 10-year-old, was crashing at a friend's house for a sleepover, and Mia had already passed out upstairs after too much popcorn and Disney+. The house was quiet, the way I liked it after a long week. Rebecca had gone out. Just a quick dinner with the ladies, she'd said, leaning against the kitchen counter in a red dress I hadn't seen before. Her hair was perfect, her makeup subtle but flawless. I'd made a joke about how lucky her friends were to have a model in their group, and she'd laughed, tossing her keys into her purse. "Don't wait up," she'd said with a grin that lingered just a bit too long. So I didn't. Or at least, I tried not to. Around midnight, I was lounging on the couch, nursing a cold beer and halfway through a rewatch of The Sopranos, when I heard the front door open. The sound was faint, cautious, even. Rebecca always let the door slam behind her when she came home. This time, she didn't. I muted the TV and waited. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved through the entryway. Then a pause. For a moment, I thought about grabbing the baseball bat I kept in the hall closet. But when Rebecca came into view, I felt the tension in my chest release. It was her, all right, but not the version I was expecting. Her hair was disheveled, and her lipstick smudged, which wasn't like her. Rebecca was meticulous about her appearance, especially when she went out. Her heels dangled from one hand, and she smelled faintly of something sweet and sharp, like perfume I didn't recognize. She froze when she saw me sitting there. "Oh, you're still up?" she said, her voice a little too high, a little too casual. She tried to brush past me, but I stood up, blocking her path. "Rebecca," I said, frowning, "what's going on?" "What do you mean?" Her eyes darted away, toward the stairs. "You're acting weird." I looked her over again. Her dress was wrinkled, and the faintest hint of a red mark peeked out from where her neckline dipped, too faint to call it a bruise, but too suggestive to ignore. Something cold and unfamiliar clawed its way into my stomach. "I'm tired, Daniel," she said sharply, brushing past me. "We can talk tomorrow." I watched her go, my gut telling me there wasn't going to be a tomorrow where things went back to normal. I stayed on the couch long after she disappeared upstairs, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, what I'd just felt. That night, sleep didn't come. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and a bad feeling I couldn't shake. I dozed off on the couch somewhere between episodes, but my mind hadn't rested. Rebecca was still upstairs, and I could hear the faint sound of water running in the bathroom. The sunlight streaming through the blinds made the events of last night feel unreal, like I could convince myself it hadn't happened. But it had. Mia came downstairs before Rebecca. She had that half-awake look kids have, rubbing her eyes and dragging her favorite stuffed bunny behind her. I made her breakfast, trying to keep things as normal as possible. As she munched on toast, her legs swinging under the table, I stared at my coffee cup, the black liquid swirling with more questions than answers. Rebecca came down about an hour later. She looked fresh, polished, and like nothing unusual had happened. That just made it worse. The red mark I thought I'd seen last night was gone. Or maybe I'd imagined it. She poured herself a coffee, kissed Mia on the head, and asked her about the sleepover she'd missed. I wanted to say something. Every part of me was screaming to call her out, but with Mia sitting right there, I couldn't do it. Not yet. So, I waited. By the time Rebecca and Mia left for their errands, something about picking up a birthday gift for one of Mia's friends, I decided on a plan. I wasn't going to let this eat at me until I had more clarity. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I made a move. So, I did the one thing I never thought I'd do in my marriage. I started looking for answers behind her back. The first place I checked was her car. It was still parked in the driveway, so I grabbed her spare key and unlocked it. Rebecca was tidy to a fault, so I didn't expect much. The interior was spotless, like always, but in the passenger seat, I found a crumpled receipt from a bar downtown. It was time-stamped from last night at 11:47 p.m. I'd never even heard of the place. It wasn't one of those trendy spots Rebecca's friends usually dragged her to. It was a dive bar, the kind of place I wouldn't expect her to step foot in. The receipt showed 2 drinks, a vodka tonic and an old-fashioned. I stared at it for what felt like forever, trying to piece it together. Rebecca didn't drink old fashions. That wasn't her. Next, I went upstairs to the bathroom. I knew it was a long shot, but I opened the small trash can by the sink anyway. Nothing but tissues and an empty box of Q-tips. I wasn't sure what I was looking for at this point. Lipstick-stained napkins? A note scribbled on a matchbook? It felt ridiculous, but I kept searching. Then, I noticed something. Her jewelry box, usually pristine and organized, was slightly ajar. The necklace I'd bought her for our 10th anniversary, her favorite piece, was missing. That struck me as odd. She only wore it on special occasions. Why would she wear it for a casual dinner with friends? It was enough to push me to the edge. When she got home that afternoon, I was waiting. Mia had gone up to her room to play, and I made sure Rebecca was alone before I cornered her in the kitchen. "Where were you last night?" I asked, leaning against the counter. She froze for just a split second, but it was enough to notice. "I told you. Dinner with the girls," she said, turning to put the groceries away. "Where exactly?" She paused, a can of soup in her hand. "What's with the questions, Daniel?" I didn't answer. I just watched her, waiting. She sighed and set the can down, her movements slower now, deliberate. "We went to Layton's, the wine bar near Clara's place." "Why?" "Layton's, huh?" I said. "That's funny. I found this in your car." I held up the receipt. Her eyes flicked to it, and I saw the moment her brain started scrambling for an excuse. "Oh, that must have been from a stop we made afterward," she said quickly. "Clara wanted to check it out. It wasn't my idea." "You didn't mention that this morning." "I didn't think I had to," she snapped, her tone defensive. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so Mia wouldn't hear. "I'm not stupid, Rebecca. Something isn't adding up, and I need you to be honest with me." "About what?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "About whatever the hell is going on." My voice came out louder than I intended, and I glanced toward the stairs to make sure Mia wasn't coming down. Rebecca's face twisted in frustration. "You're being ridiculous," she hissed. "It was just a night out." "God, Daniel, why do you always have to overthink everything?" "Overthink?" I barked a bitter laugh. "You come home looking like you've been through a wind tunnel. You've got bar receipts from places you'd never go, and now I'm supposed to believe it's all normal? Do you think I'm blind?" She didn't respond right away. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but then she clamped it shut. And that's when I saw it, the crack in her facade. It wasn't anger or frustration anymore. It was fear. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice low and steady. Her eyes widened, just for a second, before she quickly masked it with indignation. "There's no one," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction I needed to hear. I stared at her, waiting for her to say more, to deny it in a way that felt real. She didn't. "That's the best you've got?" I asked. "After everything we've been through, you can't even give me the decency of the truth?" "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice trembling now. I shook my head. "No, Rebecca, you don't get to please your way out of this." Her silence was the confirmation I didn't want but couldn't ignore. My chest felt like it was caving in, the air around me suddenly too thick to breathe. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and down the street without saying another word. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't be in the same room as her, not after that. I ended up sitting in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the receipt still clenched in my hand. Every minute that passed only made the reality of the situation sink deeper into my gut. Rebecca, the woman I trusted with my life, with my family, had betrayed me, and there was no coming back from that. When I finally went back inside, Rebecca was in the living room, pretending to watch TV. The kids were upstairs, so it was just us in that uncomfortable silence that had become the new normal. I didn't say anything right away, just sat down in the armchair across from her. My mind was spinning, but I was forcing myself to stay calm. She kept glancing at me, probably wondering if I was going to blow up or if she'd gotten away with her non-answers earlier. After what felt like forever, I finally broke the silence. "We're not doing this, Rebecca," I said. "Doing what?" she asked, her tone sharp but her voice shaky. "This. The lies. The games. You're going to tell me the truth, right now?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, crossing her arms defensively. You don't know? I laughed bitterly. Okay, let me spell it out for you. You came home late last night, looking like you'd been through a tornado. You had a bar receipt from a place you never mentioned. And when I asked you about it, you lied to my face. So let's try again. Where were you? I told you already, she snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. No, I said firmly. You told me a story. That's not the same thing. She stood up, pacing a few steps before turning to face me. What is your problem, Daniel? Why are you suddenly acting like this? Because I'm not stupid, I shot back. Because I know when something isn't right. And because you're hiding something from me. I'm not hiding anything, she yelled. Then tell me the truth. I told you the truth. Stop lying, Rebecca. I was on my feet now, my voice louder than I wanted it to be, but I couldn't help it. She flinched, her arms crossing tighter over her chest. Why don't you trust me? Trust you? I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. You've given me nothing to trust. If you were innocent, you wouldn't be dodging my questions. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might finally crack and tell me what was going on. But instead, she just shook her head and said, I can't believe this. I can't believe you're accusing me of whatever it is you think I'm doing. I stared at her, trying to decide if she was genuinely upset or just playing the victim. You're really not going to tell me, are you? I said finally. There's nothing to tell, she said quietly, her eyes darting away from mine. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. You know, it's funny. I always thought if we ever had a problem, we'd deal with it together. That's what marriage is supposed to be, right? A partnership. But here you are, shutting me out, lying to me, and expecting me to just accept it. I'm not lying, she yelled again, but her voice cracked, betraying her. Yes, you are, I said, my voice cold and even. And the worst part is, you don't even have the decency to be honest about it. Do you think I'm an idiot? Do you think I can't see what's happening here? She didn't respond, just stood there with tears streaming down her face. I deserve better than this, I said, my voice low but firm. I didn't do anything, she cried, but her words sounded hollow. I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to calm myself down. I needed to think, to figure out what to do next. I don't know who you are anymore, Rebecca, I said finally, my back still to her. And that scares the hell out of me. She didn't say anything, and after a moment, I walked out of the room. I couldn't look at her anymore. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the floor. The house was too quiet, the tension in the air suffocating. I could hear her moving around downstairs, but I didn't care what she was doing. All I cared about was figuring out how to move forward. After a while, I heard her coming up the stairs. She hesitated outside the bedroom door before finally coming in. Daniel, she said softly, her voice thick with tears. I didn't respond, just looked at her, waiting for her to speak. I'm sorry, she said finally. For what? I asked, my voice sharp. For lying to me? For whatever it is you're hiding? Or for getting caught? Her lip quivered, and she looked down at the floor. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered. There it was. The admission. It hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to take a deep breath to keep myself from losing it. What didn't you mean to happen? I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer right away, just stood there, wringing her hands. Finally, she said, I messed up, Daniel. I made a mistake. Messed up how? I demanded. What kind of mistake are we talking about here? Her silence was all the answer I needed. I stood up, walking toward her until I was right in front of her. How long? I asked. Daniel, please, she said, her voice barely a whisper. How long, Rebecca? I shouted, my voice echoing in the small room. She flinched, then finally looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. A few months, she said quietly. I stared at her, the weight of her words settling on me like a ton of bricks. Who? I asked, my voice low and cold. She hesitated, then said, It doesn't matter. It's over. Like hell it doesn't matter. I yelled. I deserve to know who the hell my wife has been sneaking around with. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to hurt you more than I already have, she said. Too late for that, I said bitterly. She didn't respond, and after a moment, I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I drove for hours that night, the low hum of the road doing nothing to quiet the storm inside me. My mind raced, replaying every word, every glance, every hesitation from Rebecca. I thought of the nights she'd come home late, the excuses she made, and the way I ignored the nagging voice in the back of my head. Now, I couldn't ignore it. I pulled into a gas station around midnight, not because I needed fuel, but because I needed a moment to breathe. I sat in the car, staring at the fluorescent lights of the station, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. Confronting her had gotten me nowhere. All I had now were half answers and a burning need to know everything. Rebecca had said it was over, but how could I trust her? She lied to my face so easily. If she could lie about where she was, who she was with, what she was doing, then what else was she hiding? I needed more than just her word. I needed the truth, all of it. By the time I got back home, the house was silent. The lights were off except for the faint glow coming from under our bedroom door. I didn't go upstairs. Instead, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where we'd argued earlier. I thought about the years we'd spent in this house, the memories we'd made here. It was hard to reconcile the warmth of those memories with the cold reality I was facing now. The next morning, Rebecca acted like nothing had happened. She made breakfast for the kids, chatted with me about her upcoming school project, and even asked if I wanted eggs. I watched her from across the table, trying to figure out if this was guilt or denial. Either way, I wasn't going to let her pretend our marriage hadn't just been blown to pieces. After breakfast, I told her I needed to talk. She looked at me warily but followed me into the living room. Rebecca, I need you to tell me everything, I said. I already did, she replied, her voice defensive. No, I said, shaking my head. You told me just enough to make me stop asking questions. That's not the same as telling me the truth. What more do you want to know? She asked, her voice rising. I want to know everything, I said. Who he is, how long it went on, where you went, what you did. I want all of it. She stared at me for a long moment, her jaw tightening. Why? She asked finally. Because I can't move forward without knowing, I said. If you have any respect for me, if you care at all about what we had, you'll tell me. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But instead, she just shook her head and said, I can't. You can't, or you won't? I asked. Both, she said quietly. I stood there, staring at her, the weight of her refusal pressing down on me. She wasn't going to tell me. I realized then that if I wanted the truth, I was going to have to find it myself. For the next few days, I played along. I went to work, came home, helped the kids with their homework, and pretended that everything was fine. Rebecca seemed relieved by my silence, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided meeting my eyes for too long. In the meantime, I started digging. I went through her phone, her laptop, her emails, anything I could get my hands on. She must have been careful because there was nothing obvious. But then I remembered the receipt from the bar. That night, after Rebecca had gone to bed, I called the bar. I told the bartender I'd lost something there and asked if they could check their security footage from the night in question. I didn't expect them to say yes, but to my surprise, they agreed. The next evening, I drove to the bar after work. The bartender, a woman in her 40s with a sharp gaze, led me to a back room where the security monitors were. What exactly are you looking for? She asked. I'm not sure, I admitted. I just need to know who my wife was with. She gave me a long look, then nodded. All right, let's see what we can find. She pulled up the footage from the night of the receipt and fast-forwarded until Rebecca appeared on screen. My heart pounded as I watched her walk into the bar, her red dress standing out even in the grainy footage. A man joined her a few minutes later. He was tall, with dark hair and a confident stride. I didn't recognize him, but the way he leaned in close to her, the way she smiled at him, it told me everything I needed to know. Do you know him? The bartender asked. No, I said, my voice tight. Want me to print a still for you? I nodded. and she handed me a black and white image a few minutes later. I stared at the photo, burning the man's face into my memory. When I got home, Rebecca was in the kitchen, making dinner. I walked up to her and placed the photo on the counter. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice steady. She froze, her hand gripping the knife she was holding. Slowly, she turned to face me, her eyes wide with shock. "Daniel," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said. "Just tell me who he is." Her lip trembled, and she looked down at the photo. "His name is Aaron," she said finally. "How do you know him?" I asked. "He's someone I met at work," she said, her voice barely audible. "How long?" 3 months, she said, tears streaming down her face. "Are you still seeing him?" "No," she said quickly. "I ended it weeks ago." I stared at her, trying to decide if I believed her. Part of me wanted to, but another part of me couldn't forget the lies she'd already told. "You've destroyed everything," I said finally, my voice shaking. "Do you even realize that?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt empty. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked away, the photo still clenched in my hand. For days, I avoided Rebecca as much as I could. The house was quieter than it had ever been, and even the kids seemed to sense something was wrong. I couldn't bring myself to pretend anymore, but I wasn't ready to confront her again. Not yet. I had too much to figure out. Rebecca stayed out of my way, either because she felt guilty or because she knew I wasn't done digging. Either way, it didn't matter. I told her she destroyed everything, and I meant it. What we had, the trust, the connection, the partnership, was gone. Now, all I felt was anger. I thought about Aaron constantly, his face burned into my brain from that grainy security footage. It wasn't enough for me to know his name or how long this had been going on. I needed more. I needed to make sure neither of them forgot what they'd done to me. So, I started planning. First, I found out everything I could about him. A quick search of his name in the company directory gave me the basics. Aaron Walsh, 41, divorced, a mid-level manager in some department I didn't care about. From there, it wasn't hard to find more. His social media accounts were public, which told me he had a teenage son from his previous marriage and a habit of posting motivational quotes that made me want to punch him. The deeper I dug, the angrier I got. He wasn't some charming, once-in-a-lifetime romance for Rebecca. He was ordinary, generic, the kind of guy you'd forget the second he left the room. And that's who she threw away our marriage for. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The first step in my plan was gathering evidence. I'd already recorded the conversation with Rebecca where she admitted to the affair. Next, I needed proof of their relationship, messages, emails, anything that would connect them. Rebecca had been careful to delete most of their communication, but she'd overlooked one thing: her work email. She must have thought I wouldn't have access to it, but she underestimated me. As the IT manager for our company, I had admin-level access to everything. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A string of emails between her and Aaron, some professional, others not. I printed everything. Pages of flirtatious exchanges, plans to meet up after work, even a few risque messages that made my stomach turn. I added them to the growing folder of evidence I was compiling, alongside the photo from the bar and the audio recording of our conversation. By the time I was done, I had enough to blow up both their lives. The next step was figuring out how to use it. I didn't just want to confront Aaron. I wanted to humiliate him, to make him feel the same gut-wrenching betrayal I'd felt. And I wanted Rebecca to watch it all unfold. So, I waited. A week later, the opportunity presented itself. The company was hosting a quarterly meeting, a big event where all the employees gathered to discuss updates and goals. Rebecca and Aaron would both be there, along with the rest of the staff. It was the perfect stage. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early and set up everything I needed. I plugged a USB drive into the presentation laptop, queued up a slideshow, and made sure the files were ready to go. Then, I took my seat near the back of the room and waited. When Rebecca and Aaron walked in, they didn't notice me at first. They were seated at opposite ends of the room, but I caught the quick glance they exchanged. It was subtle, but I saw it. That little connection they thought they could hide from everyone. The meeting began, and the usual corporate nonsense filled the first hour. I barely listened, my focus on the USB drive and the chaos it was about to unleash. Finally, the CEO called for a break, and I saw my chance. As everyone filed out for coffee and snacks, I approached the laptop at the front of the room. No one noticed as I switched the slides to my prepared presentation. When the break ended and the employees returned, I stood near the back, my heart pounding in anticipation. The CEO resumed speaking, advancing the slides with the remote in his hand. The first few were normal, sales charts, quarterly goals, but then my slides appeared. The first one was a photo of Rebecca and Aaron at the bar, their heads close together, his hand on her arm. Gasps rippled through the room, and the CEO froze mid-sentence, staring at the screen. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice sharp. Before anyone could answer, the slideshow advanced to the next slide. An email exchange between Rebecca and Aaron, full of flirtatious banter and plans to meet up after hours. The room erupted. People whispered and pointed, some craning their necks to get a better look. Rebecca's face turned bright red, and she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Stop this!" she yelled, her voice shaking. But the slides kept coming. More emails, screenshots of text messages, and finally, a recording of Rebecca admitting to the affair. By the time the slideshow ended, the room was silent. All eyes were on Rebecca and Aaron, who looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Rebecca turned to me, her face a mixture of rage and desperation. "How could you do this?" she hissed. I stepped forward, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. "How could you?" I shot back. "You destroyed our marriage, humiliated me, and thought you could get away with it. Well, guess what? Now everyone knows who you really are." She didn't respond, just stared at me with tears streaming down her face. Aaron, on the other hand, tried to save what little dignity he had left. "This is a private matter," he said, his voice trembling. "You had no right." "I had every right," I interrupted. "You slept with my wife. You made it my business." The CEO finally stepped in, demanding that we all leave the room while he sorted out the mess. I walked out without a word, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed me. That night, Rebecca tried to talk to me, but I wouldn't let her. "You made your bed," I said coldly. "Now lie in it." I slept in the guest room, knowing there was no going back from this. And honestly, I didn't want to. The days after the meeting were a blur of fallout. The office was buzzing with gossip, and I quickly became the center of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. I wasn't naive. I knew what I did would make waves, but I didn't care. My goal had never been to win a popularity contest. It was to make sure that Rebecca and Aaron faced consequences for what they'd done. The day after the incident, Rebecca didn't come home until late. When she walked in, she looked hollow, like she'd spent the day trying to outrun her humiliation and failed. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I lost my job," she said finally, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I wasn't surprised. She worked for a company that prided itself on professionalism, and her affair with a colleague, exposed so publicly, was a direct violation of their code of conduct. Aaron had been fired too. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her tone bitter. "Happy?" I repeated, staring at her. "No, Rebecca, I'm not happy. Nothing about this makes me happy. But I'm not sorry either. You destroyed our marriage, and you're upset because you have to deal with the consequences? That's on you." She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she let out a long, shaky sigh and said, "What happens now?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms as I looked at her. "I don't know, Rebecca. What do you think happens now? You think we just go back to normal? Pretend this never happened?" "No," she said quickly. "I know we can't go back to the way things were. But I don't want to give up on us." I let out a harsh laugh. "You didn't think about us when you were sneaking around with Aaron." "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "A mistake?" I shot back. "Rebecca, a mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to betray me, to betray our family. And now you want me to just forgive you." "I don't know what I want," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. I I don't want to lose you, Daniel. Well, you should have thought about that before, I said coldly. She didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, staring down at her hands as the silence stretched between us. The next few days were tense. We barely spoke to each other, only exchanging words when absolutely necessary. I avoided her as much as possible, spending most of my time at work or in the guest room. The kids noticed the tension, but I didn't know how to explain it to them without shattering their world too. Eventually, Rebecca approached me with a proposal. "Let's go to counseling," she said, her voice hesitant. "If not for us, then for the kids." I stared at her for a long moment, considering her words. I didn't believe counseling would fix what she'd done, but maybe it would help me figure out how to move forward, for my own sake, if nothing else. "Fine," I said finally. "I'll go. But don't think for a second that this guarantees anything." We started going to sessions twice a week. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, asked all the usual questions. What brought us here? How did we feel about the situation? What did we want to achieve through counseling? Rebecca did most of the talking in those early sessions. She apologized over and over again, explaining how she felt lost, unappreciated, and disconnected from me. She said the affair wasn't about Aaron. It was about her own insecurities and mistakes. I listened, but I didn't feel any closer to forgiving her. The hurt ran too deep, and every time I looked at her, I saw the betrayal etched into her face. The sessions became a chore, something I endured rather than embraced. I wasn't there to save our marriage. I was there to understand why it fell apart and what I needed to do to move on. One night, after a particularly exhausting session, Rebecca and I sat in the car outside the therapist's office. She turned to me, her eyes red and swollen. "Do you think we'll ever get past this?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to, for the kids' sake, but I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded. "I understand." The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me wanted to make her feel the same pain I felt, to drag this out until she was as broken as I was. But another part of me just wanted to let go and move on. It took weeks of soul-searching to figure out what to do. I spent countless nights lying awake, replaying everything in my head, trying to imagine a future where we could be happy again. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see it. So, one evening, I sat Rebecca down and told her my decision. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I've tried, Rebecca. I've gone to counseling, I've listened to your apologies, and I've tried to find a way to forgive you. But I can't. Every time I look at you, I see what you did, and I don't think that's ever going to change." She didn't cry this time. She just nodded, her face pale and her eyes hollow. "What does this mean?" she asked quietly. "It means I'm filing for divorce," I said. "We'll figure out the details, custody, the house, everything. But we can't keep pretending this is going to work." She looked down at her hands, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she just said, "Okay." The weeks that followed were painful but necessary. We told the kids together, assuring them that we both loved them and that this wasn't their fault. Ethan cried, and Mia asked if we could still have family dinners sometimes. It broke my heart, but I knew this was the right choice. Rebecca moved out a month later, and I started the long process of rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy, but every day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. In the end, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about letting her off the hook. It was about freeing myself from the weight of her betrayal. I didn't need to forget what she did, but I needed to let go of the anger and pain that had consumed me for so long. And that's what I did. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Bye-bye. Subscribe to the channel